Hello, Catherine.
Hello.
Hi, lovely to have you
Good
join
evening.
us. So lovely. Everyone, we are in Parshat Metzora, which is in the book of Leviticus, chapter 14, beginning with the very first verse. We'll read through our English translation. I'll share with you a bit of a focused study, and then we'll open it up for our collaborative conversation. If you'd like to go ahead and unmute it this time, we can say our blessing for the opportunity of immersing ourselves in Torah. Baruch atah
Adonai,
Eloheinu
Eloheinu,
melech
melech
haolam,
haolam,
asher
kishanu
kishanu
mitzvotav,
mitzivanu
so
divrei Torah. Thank you, God, for this opportunity to immerse ourselves in words, deeds, and relationships of Torah. Book of Leviticus, chapter 14, beginning with verse 1. Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, "This shall be the Torah of the Metzora on the day of his purification. He shall be brought to the Kohen. The Kohen shall go forth to the outside of the camp. The Kohen shall look, and behold, the tzara'at affliction had been healed from the Metzora. The Kohen shall command, and for the person being purified, there shall be taken 2 live, clean birds, cedar wood, crimson thread, and hyssop. The Kohen shall command, and the one bird shall be slaughtered into an earthenware vessel over spring water. As for the live bird, he shall take it with the cedar wood and the crimson thread and the hyssop, and he shall dip them and the live bird into the blood of the bird that was slaughtered over the spring water." We're now on verse 7. And Mark Thompson, would you like to read a little bit there, starting at verse 7?
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. He shall then sprinkle it 7 times on him who is to be cleansed of the eruption, and cleanse him, and he shall set the live bird free in the open country. The one to be cleansed shall wash his clothes, shave off all his hair, and bathe in water, then he shall be clean. After that, he may enter the camp, but he must remain outside his tent 7 days. On the 7th day, he shall shave off all his hair of head, beard, and eyebrows. When he has shaved off all his hair, he shall wash his clothes and bathe his body in water. Then he shall be clean.
Thank you so
On
much.
the 8th day,
Let me invite thank you so much, Mark. Let me invite Susan and David, if you'd like to share some readings there, beginning at verse 10.
Look at the name.
And on the 8th day, he shall take 2 unblemished sheep and 1 unblemished yearling ewe, and 3/10 of semolina flour, a grain offering mixed with oil, and 1 log of oil. And the cleansing priest shall set the man cleansing himself together with them before the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Go ahead.
And the priest shall take one of the lambs and bring it forward as a guilt offering and the log of oil. And he shall elevate them, an elevation offering in front of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. And he shall slaughter the lamb in the place where he slaughters the sin offering and the burnt offering, in the place of the holy, because like the sin offering, the guilt offering is the priest's. It is the holy of holies. And the priest shall take some of the blood of the guilt offering, and the priest shall put it on the right earlobe, the one being purified, and on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. And the priest shall take some of the log of oil and pour it on the priest's left hand, and the priest shall dip his right finger into some of the oil that is on his left hand and sprinkle some of the oil with his finger 7 times in front of Yud-Heh Vav-Heh. And the priest shall put some of the remaining oil that is on his hand on the right earlobe of the one being purified, and on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, over the blood of the guilt offering. And he shall put what is left of the oil that is on the priest's hand on the head of the one being purified. And the priest shall make atonement over him in front of Yud-Heh Vav-Heh. And the priest shall make a sin offering and make atonement over the one being purified from his impurity. And after that, he shall slaughter the burnt offering. And the priest shall make the burnt offering and the grain offering at the altar. And the priest shall make atonement over him, and he will be pure.
Thank you so much, both of you. Richard Kramer, would you like to read at verse 21?
Yes, Rabbi, thank you. If, however, he is poor and his means are insufficient, he shall take 1 male lamb for a guilt offering, to be waved in expiation for him, 1/10 of a measure of choice flour with oil mixed in for a meal offering, and a log of oil, and 2 turtle doves and 2 pigeons, which are within his means, the one to be the sin offering and the other the burnt offering. On the 8th day of his cleansing, he shall bring them to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting before the Lord. The priest shall take the lamb of guilt offering and the log of oil and wave them as a wave offering before the Lord. When the lamb of guilt offering has been slaughtered, the priest shall take some of the blood of the guilt offering and put it on the ridge of the right ear of the one being cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. The priest shall then pour some of the oil onto the palm of his own left hand. And with the finger of his right hand, the priest shall sprinkle some of the oil that is in the palm of his left hand 7 times before the Lord. Some of the oil in his palm shall be put by the priest on the ridge of the right ear of the one being cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, over the same places as the blood of the guilt offering. And what is left of oil in his palm, the priest shall put on the head of the one being cleansed, to make expiation for him before the Lord. He shall then offer one of the turtle doves or pigeons.
Richard, let me invite someone. Richard, thank you so much. I'm going to invite Dave Leb. Would you like to read a little bit at verse 30?
Okay. That person shall then offer one of the turtle doves or pigeons, depending upon the person's means, whichever the person can afford. The one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering, together with the meal offering. Thus the priest shall make expiation before Adonai for the one being purified. Such is the ritual for one who has a scaly affection and whose means for purification are limited. Adonai spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, when you enter the land of Canaan that I give you as a possession, and I inflict an eruptive plague upon a house in the land that you possess, the owner of the house shall come and tell the priest, saying, something like a plague has appeared upon my house. The priest shall order the house cleared before the priest enters to examine the plague, so that nothing in the house may become impure. After that, the priest shall enter to examine the house. If, when he examines the plague in the walls of the house is found to consist of greenish or reddish streaks that appear to go deep in the wall, the priest shall come out of the house to the entrance of the house and close up the house for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest shall return. If he sees that the plague has spread on the walls of the house, the priest shall order the stones with the plague in them to be pulled out and cast aside the city into an impure place. The house shall be scraped inside all around, and the coating that is scraped off and dumped outside the city in an impure place. They shall take the other stones and replace these stones with them and take other coating and plaster the house.
Thank you so much, Dave. Let me invite June. Would you like to continue reading there, starting with verse 43?
Mute.
There it goes. Okay, 43. And if the plague come again and break out in the house, after that the stones have been taken out, and after the house has been scraped, and after it is plastered, then the priest shall come in and look. And behold, if the plague be spread in the house, it is a malignant leprosy in the house, it is unclean. And he shall break down the house, the stones of it, the timber thereof, and all the mortar of the house. And he shall carry them forth out of the city into an unclean place. Moreover, he that goeth into the house all the while that is shut up shall be unclean until the even. And he that lieth in the house shall wash his clothes. And he that eateth in the house shall wash his clothes. And if the priest shall come in and look, and behold, the plague hath not spread in the house, after the house was plastered, then the priest shall pronounce the house clean, because the plague is healed. And he shall take to cleanse the house 2 birds, and cedar wood, and scarlet, and hyssop. And he shall kill one of the birds in an earthen vessel over running water. And he shall take the cedar wood, and the hyssop, and the scarlet, and the living bird, and dip them in the blood of the slain bird, and in the running water, and sprinkle the house 7 times. And he shall cleanse the house with the blood of the bird, and with the running water, and with the living bird, with the cedar wood, with the hyssop, and with scarlet. But he shall let go the living bird out of the city into the open field. So shall he make atonement for the house, and it shall be clean.
Thank you so much. Robert, would you like to read a little bit, beginning at verse 54?
Yes, thank you. This is the law for all manner of plague of leprosy and scald, and for the leprosy of a garment and of a house, and for a rising and for a scab and for a bright spot, to teach when it is unclean and when it is clean. This is the law of leprosy. And the Lord spake unto Moses and to Aaron, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, when any man hath a running issue out of his flesh, because of his issue, he is unclean. And this shall be his uncleanness in his issue, whether his flesh run with his issue, or his flesh be stopped from his issue, it is his uncleanness. Every bed whereon he lieth that hath the issue is unclean, and everything whereon he sitteth shall be unclean. And whosoever toucheth his bed shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water, and be unclean until the even. And he that sitteth on anything whereon he sat, that hath the issue, shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water, and be unclean until the even.
Thank you so much, Robert. Let me invite Paul. Would you like to continue reading there at verse 7?
Thank you, Rabbi. One who touches the flesh of the man with the discharge shall immerse his garments and immerse himself in the water, and he remains contaminated until the evening. If the person with the discharge will spit upon a pure person, he shall immerse his garments and immerse himself in the water, and he remains contaminated until the evening. Any riding equipment upon which the person with the discharge will ride shall be contaminated. And whoever touches anything that will be beneath him shall become contaminated until evening. And whoever carries them shall immerse his garments and immerse himself in the water, and he remains contaminated until the evening. Whomever the man with the discharge touches without having rinsed his hands in the water shall immerse his garments and immerse himself in the water, and he remains contaminated until the evening. Pottery that the man with the discharge will touch shall be broken, and any wooden utensil shall be rinsed in water.
Thank you, Paul. And let me invite Robin, would you like to read a little bit, beginning at verse 13?
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. When the one with a discharge becomes purified of his discharge, he shall count off 7 days for his purification, wash those clothes, and bathe his body in fresh water. Then he shall be pure. On the 8th day, he shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons and come before Adonai at the entrance of the tent of meeting and give them to the priest. The priest shall offer them, the one as a purgation offering and the other as a burnt offering. Thus the priest shall make expiation on his behalf for his discharge before Adonai. When a man has an emission of semen, he shall bathe his whole body in water and remain impure until evening. All cloth or leather on which semen falls shall be washed in water and remain impure until evening. Likewise for a woman, when a man has carnal relations with her, both shall bathe in water and remain impure until evening.
Thank you so much, Robin. Jim, would you like to read a little bit, beginning at verse 19?
Thank you, Rabbi. When a woman has a discharge, her discharge being blood from her body, she shall remain in her impurity 7 days. Whoever touches her shall be unclean until evening. Anything that she lies on during impurity shall be unclean, and anything that she sits on shall be unclean. Anyone who touches her bedding shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain unclean until evening. And anyone who touches any object on which she has sat shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain unclean until evening. Be it the bedding or be it the object on which she has sat, on touching it, he shall be unclean until evening. And if a man lies with her, her impurity is communicated to him. He shall be unclean 7 days, and any bedding on which he lies shall become unclean.
Thank you so much. And Gary, would you like to read a little bit there, beginning at verse 25?
Thank you. When a woman has had a discharge of blood for many days, not at the time of her menstrual separation, or when she has a discharge beyond her period of menstrual separation, she shall be impure, as though at the time of her menstrual separation, as long as her discharge lasts. Any bedding on which she lies while her discharge lasts shall be for her like bedding during her menstrual separation, and any object on which she sits shall become impure, as it does during her menstrual separation. All those who touch them shall be impure, and shall wash their clothes, bathe in water, and remain impure until evening. When she becomes purified of her discharge, she shall count off 7 days, and after that she shall be pure. On the 8th day she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, and bring them to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The priest shall offer the one as purgation offering, and the other as a burnt offering, and the priest shall make expiation on her behalf for her impure discharge before the Eternal. You shall put the Israelites on guard against their impurity, lest they die through their impurity by defiling my tabernacle, which is among them. Such is the ritual concerning one who has a discharge. Concerning him who has an emission of semen and becomes impure thereby, and concerning her whose condition is that of menstrual separation, and concerning anyone, male or female, who has a discharge, and concerning a man who lies with an impure woman.
Thank you so much, everyone. That's our entire Torah portion for this week. I'd like to share with you a little bit of focus study. If you have a copy of the study sheet, I invite you to take it out at this time. And just as a way of introduction into our study for tonight, want to once again take a little bit of a step back and think about the book of Leviticus as a whole entity. There are many ways to look at the book of Leviticus. One of them is to look upon the book as, if you will, enshrining the preeminent authority of the priestly class and the fact that they are in charge of this whole set of rituals and that they have a unique role and a hierarchically placed role within the structure of Israelite society. And another way to look upon it is a deep and profound concern that the book is placing on what is being called matters of purity and impurity, which we can talk about in a moment. And I want to share with you how I've been looking at the book of Leviticus this year, which is very unique for me, which is to see the book of Leviticus as interrupting the narrative flow of Torah. When we began with this really epic story in the book of Genesis, the creation of everything, introducing us to these matriarchal and patriarchal characters, and then moving into the great drama of the book of Exodus, where there's a confrontation between God and Pharaoh and the liberation of the Israelites from hundreds of years of slavery. And then we'll get to the book of Numbers, which continues the journey through the wilderness and all the ups and downs that adventure encompasses. And then we get to Deuteronomy, which is kind of a summation, a reiteration of this entire journey. So the book of Leviticus is unique in the sense that there's virtually no narrative form to the book of Leviticus, unlike the other four books. There are only actually two stories that appear within Leviticus. It is primarily seems to be a book of rules and instructions. And rather than focusing on the Israelites as an entire people, it focuses primarily on one subsection of that people, that namely the Levites. So what, to me, I look upon it and I say, well, why is there this interruption? And the way I've been reading the book of Leviticus this year is that it intentionally interrupts this narrative flow with almost as if it is a sudden recognition by the wisdom we call Torah to acknowledge, these people are on their way to the promised land. And there's a recognition that neither the people themselves nor the world itself is perfect. And that there has to be some way to address these imperfections so that people don't become either cynical or that we have ways of working through these moments of frustration and awareness of imperfection so that we can continue on the path that we're supposed to be on, which is to constantly be refining our character and achieving a sense of fulfillment so that we can serve and live as free people in a land of promise. So I want to suggest that this year I've been reading the book of Leviticus as providing us with some kind of practices, some kind of lessons that we can each person can begin to learn how to deal with instances of imperfection, instances of distress, instances of frustration, and find some way to emerge out of them. When we're talking about purity and impurity within this schema, what we're talking about is impurity represents death and purity represents life. So in that kind of scheme, anything that takes us away from life, that causes us to become distracted from that kind of awareness, from that being on the path of life and fulfillment, has to be addressed in some way. It has to be corrected, has to be remediated in order to get us back on the path towards life. So anything having to do that causes us to think about death, the loss of possibility of life, requires some kind of adjustment. So what I'd like to focus on for this week in particular is to make our point of entry into this week's study a painting that's on the study sheet. And it's a painting by the American artist Clifford Still Clifford Still was a very interesting figure in American art. He was both, in a sense, a great pioneer in the art world, and he was also an outsider to that art world. Clifford Still was born in 1904 in North Dakota, and he spent his formative years in Spokane, Washington, and also in Alberta, Canada, where the family owned a wheat ranch. So he spent his early years in that kind of a setting, in a setting of being on a farm, of being in wide open spaces, and he began to develop his sense of being an artist, going to art school in that part of the country in the 1920s, 1930s. And he began to develop a rather unique style in mid-1930s, and certainly by early 1940s. He had developed a very unique style, which was to begin to completely remove any representational subjects from his work and began to develop what became known as pure abstract art. In fact, he was probably among his contemporaries the first of the American artists to develop an abstract approach to his artistic work. Others became more famous, perhaps. We can think of Jackson Pollock, Bernard Newman, Mark Rothko, and William de Kooning, and many others who became more famous. Clifford Still eventually did go to New York in the early 40s, I believe it was, which is where this whole new movement was beginning to develop, and he became quite an influence on the development of abstract expressionism. But he remained really an outsider to that world. He felt very uncomfortable in the New York art scene, and he soon returned back out west, which is where he spent the rest of his life. So in that sense, he was both a pioneer, someone coming from the wide open spaces of the West, of Washington and in Canada, and then coming to New York, where he influenced his contemporaries, but was an outsider to the world that he helped to influence. So I'm looking at his artwork as perhaps conveying both that sense of being a pioneer and being an outsider of some kind. So I want to share with you something he said about his artwork. He said, these are paintings, these are not paintings in the usual sense. They are life and death, merging in fearful union. They kindle a fire, and through them I breathe again, holding golden cords and finding my own revelation. So here on this canvas that you see, which is from 1948, we have here the complete, we are completely disabused of any recognizable figure, object, or subject. What we're presented with is this field of colors, and indeed they are colors from radically different ends of the spectrum, and they are either in conflict with one another, they're engaged with one another, but in any case, we don't have any identifiable character or object or subject that we can begin to perhaps more easily understand what's happening in the painting. Instead, we're left to focus on this engagement between compositional elements, foreground and background, light and dark, and in particular, a confrontation of colors from these different ends of the spectrum. We'll get to why he has the name here, 1948C, when we get towards the end of our study. But I picked this painting out in part because we have this brilliant color background, this yellow, and then we have these splotches, if you will, black and white, engaging with one another, and some more black with white and another color, perhaps a faint red up there. So I'd like to kind of explore this notion of both the artist, Clifford Still, being an outsider to the work that he has now not only created, but to the world that he has influenced with his work, and what it might mean that we're now left with colors rather than any clearly identifiable subject, object, or any other representational image to address. So I've entitled this week's study session, "To Make the Outcast Like a Priest." And the first thing I noticed, which really had never noticed before in all the years that I've read this week's Torah portion, occurs towards the beginning here. And this is from chapter 13, verse 2. If a person has sara'at. I looked at that and I kind of read forward a little bit, and then I read backwards a little bit, including into last week's Torah portion. And I was looking like, well, what causes sara'at? And in the book of Leviticus, there's no etiology for this condition. There's no explanation of what the source of this is. There's no analysis trying to explain why someone has this sara'at. Someone just does have it. Now, elsewhere outside the book of Leviticus, there are references to characters who have this, and there is some either within the text itself speculation about, or commentary that makes it easy to understand from the text why someone has this, such as when Miriam, if you recall, has this condition that we'll encounter that in the book of Numbers, and there it's easily explained, oh, she spoke out against Moses and immediately had this condition. We'll see that in other parts of the Bible where characters have this condition, and it is assumed or explained either within the text itself or quite easily within commentary that they have it because they have done something wrong that has brought this about. But the book of Leviticus doesn't do that. It just says sometimes someone may have this condition. In number 2, it will begin to address what to do about it. We encounter this from verses 2 through 3. This shall be the Torah of the Metzora on the day of his purification. The priest shall go out to the outside of the camp. So the first thing I noticed was, well, that's interesting to say the Torah of the Metzora. That could either be read as it is in many translations as the rules regarding, or the instruction regarding, or the commandment regarding. But Torah can also be understood as meaning teaching. So there's some teaching that's going on here about the dealing with the Metzora, the person who has this condition. Let's hold that in mind as we continue to go through our focused material here. And then the verse 3, the priest shall go out to the outside of the camp. That fascinated me to think about the priest who is to remain the purest, if you will, of all the figures in the camp, because they're supposed to be conducting all these services. This individual is not brought to the priest. The priest has to go outside the camp. In other words, the priest has to leave behind the barriers, the defenses, the sanctity, the purity, if you will, of his world and his position, and go out to where someone is who has this stigmatizing condition called sara'at. Then we begin to look at the rituals that's engaged in by the high priest when presented with someone who has this condition. And what is clear is that the priest is not engaged in curing someone of this condition. The priest's role is to examine, observe, analyze, and declare that the condition exists, and then to declare once the condition no longer exists. And then the role of the priest at that point is to then conduct some kind of purification ceremony that enables this person to now reintegrate back into the community. So the role of the priest is not to cure this condition, it's to help the person re-enter a society. So let's look a little bit at what the ritual is that the priest conducts as part of this purification ceremony. On the 8th day, the person being purified shall be placed before Adonai at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The priest puts the blood of the offering and oil of offering on the ridge of the Metzora's right ear, the thumb of his right hand, and the big toe of the right foot. I read that and I thought, that sounds familiar. And so I looked back into a previous week's Torah portion in chapter 8 and read this. Moses took some of the blood and placed it upon the middle of Aaron's right ear, upon the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. The ritual that the priest is engaging in as a way to help the person who has had this stigmatizing condition that has placed that individual outside the camp to proclaim a purification of this person, to help this person ease back into the community, is exactly the same ritual that was conducted to anoint Aaron and Aaron's sons as the priests. In other words, the priests were considered to be the height of purity, so that they can conduct these services that would connect the community with God. And they are, in turn, making the person who has been the most stigmatized person in the community, forcing that person to be placed outside the camp. They are conducting a ritual that replicates the ritual that was done for the high priest. They are making this individual the most pure person in the community, akin to a priest. So if you turn over, there's more to this notion as I thought about it, that connects a relationship between the priest and those who are suffering some kind of condition that has placed them at the far end of impurity. And to make that person who's at the far end of the impurity end of the spectrum, to help that person become identified as now the most pure person within the community. So if you like to turn over your study sheet, I'd like to share with you some of the ritual that is used in preparing a dead body for burial. And one of the rituals that's done in terms of making a dead body, which now is also at the far end of the impure end of the spectrum of impurity. A dead body constitutes pure impurity. Why? Because it is a clear reminder of death. Those who encounter the dead body are now being drawn away from their focus on life, and they're now being focused on life's fragility, on its potential, on its ability to corrode and collapse, and to end. So the process of preparing a dead body, in a sense, is to try and counter the draw that death can take us to. So let's look at what is happening here. In addition to washing the body is then dressed in certain garments in being prepared for burial. So first, one of the four main objects that the body is traditionally dressed in preparation for burial is what's known as a ketonet, tunic, michnasayim, pants, and an avnet, which is like a sash, and the mitznefet, which is a turban, a hat. So those are the four main objects that a body will be dressed in. And let's look at where else those exact same four terms appear. When those items are being placed on a dead body, there are verses from Torah that are to be recited. And they are from the book of Leviticus. And here from chapter 16. These are the verses that those who are dressing a dead body in these four objects, ketonet, michnasayim, avnet, mitznefes, these are the verses that those individuals are to recite. Aaron shall wear a holy linen tunic, ketonet, and breeches, michnasayim, of linen shall be upon his flesh, and he shall tie a linen sash, avnet, upon himself, and he shall cover his head with a linen turban, mitznefet. These are verses that are being recited as the dead body is being dressed in these articles, and they are the verses that are recited upon the dressing of the high priest. And we have from the prophet Zechariah regarding, in particular, the turban. The angel of Adonai said, remove the filthy garments from upon him, Joshua the high priest. And the angel said to Joshua the high priest, see, I have removed your onus, your guilt from you, and dressed you with clean attire. And then I said, let a pure turban be placed upon his head. So they laid out a pure turban on his head and dressed him in clean garments as the angel of Adonai stood by. The dead body, the most iconic of all impure purity within this scheme that we were talking about, is now being made into the figure that is most iconically pure within the scheme, and that is the high priest. So here we're dealing with a system that acknowledges contact with death, and it's not just physical death. It has to do with anything that takes us away from our path of embracing life and reaching fulfillment. And there is this ritualized way of bringing this person back onto the path. I want to return to Clifford Still and see how this ties together. Clifford Still said this about his paintings. He said, it is intolerable to be stopped by a frame's edge. I think when he looked at a painting, for him, the painting had no end. It had no static definition. It had no border, if you will. In that sense, Clifford Still was being somewhat subversive about the very medium in which he was working, to say, yes, I'm putting pigment on a well-defined medium called a canvas, which has borders to it, but that's not really the extent of it. There's more there than the edges seem to imply. I want to suggest that, if you will, that there's something subversive happening in this week's Torah portion as well. That while the role of the priest seems to be, as we kind of easily read through the book of Leviticus, defining purity and impurity and saying what should and shouldn't be done, and the notion that when borders are pierced, then things become impure. What this week's Torah portion is, I think, suggesting is that, and that is not a moral judgment. It is just a condition of life, and there's no way to escape our contact with impurity and imperfection. And what our responsibility is, what my responsibility as the most iconic figure of purity in the community, my job is not to remain pure. My job is to go outside the camp to deal with the person who has now been stigmatized and placed outside the camp. My responsibility is to imbue that figure with my level of the level of purity that's been imputed to me, in order to bring that person back into the camp. I bring Clifford Still in for a very particular reason as well. Clifford Still did not give titles, that is, name titles, to any of his paintings. They all had some kind of numbers attached to them, which, as we saw today, was 1948-3. He didn't want his paintings to have titles to them because he felt that would give people too much information, that it would predispose people to thinking that they knew what that painting was about, or that they knew what he thought the painting was about. He wanted people to come up with their own understandings about what the painting was about, and didn't want titles to get in the way. So he said this: the pictures are to be without title of any kind. I want no allusions to interfere with or assist the spectator. Before them, I want the spectator to be on their own. And if one finds in them an imagery unkind or unpleasant or evil, let him or her look to the state of their own soul. At the Clifford Still Museum, they have a partnership with a project called the Eye to Eye Project. The Eye to Eye Project is a project designed to help high school students who have learning disabilities feel less stigmatized and to become more successful in their academic pursuits. And in particular, there will be college students who have similar conditions, will be assigned to work with these high school students to help them become more empowered, to overcome their sense of isolation from other students. And the Clifford Still Museum will bring these students into the museum to encounter Clifford Still paintings, which they are presented with no assumptions about what's happening in the painting. And they're given an opportunity to say, what do you see there? What do you experience there? What do you think is happening there? And then they'll be supplied with some materials to begin crafting their own creations in response to they experience. So it is a way of helping these students feel and their own creativity, their own power, and to overcome the stigmas that they may have experienced previously from within their academic settings. So I've entitled this week's study session, "To Make the Outcast Like a Priest," because I think that's what the role of leadership in any community to do, is not to enhance their own sense of privilege and separation from others, but to constantly be reaching out to those on the margins, to those who have, for one reason or another, been felt that they are outcasted, that they are stigmatized in some way. and to lend to those whatever aura of respectability, of acceptance that they as leaders have, to then imbue that, to share that with them, and to help them come back into the center of a community, and to know that they too have gifts and powers and worth. And with that, I'd love to hear and share what all of you have been thinking and responding to in this week's Torah portion. I know Stephen Sherry, you've got your raised hand, so why don't you go ahead and unmute and share with us?
Well, it's not to really share, but just to ask some questions. As we were reading today's Torah portion, I was just wondering, and Steve looked it up because I was wondering when mankind really recognized that there was contagion. And it sounded to me as we were reading it as though, particularly the thing with the wall, it just reminds me of things that I have read about people trying to get rid, excuse me for saying, mold in their house. I mean, it sort of described that. And I wondered if there were, what was available to people then, and am I just barking up the wrong tree and has nothing to do with this, or what?
No, it's a very good question. So real quickly, because I see we have a bunch of other hands as well. In the ancient world, there were lots of approaches to disease, especially epidemics. And one of them was and what the etiology of those conditions were. And one approach was that it was a form of punishment from some divinity. Another was that it was some kind of demons in the world who were causing mischief. Another, there was some kind of magic that was being involved. And each one of those required a different response based upon what you thought the etiology was. And what I just think is fascinating in this Torah portion is that's not even addressed. The notion of what might be the source of this? Why is this happening? All this is saying is it happens. It's just a matter of life that sometimes these things happen. And what we need to what we need is to have a ritualized way of bringing people back. Okay, so with that, Mark and then Richard.
Thank you. I noticed that the demands of the sin offerings that the priest required to offer expiation, they differed according to the individual's wealth. Much as the priest must go outside of the camp to perform expiation, I view this also as an act of compassion, maybe even a first principle of justice. So I was wondering whether, is this the first time in Torah that we're introduced to this teaching of making distinctions or accommodations among individuals of different economic status?
We've seen it somewhat, but this is, I think, a very stark example of it, that if you can't afford this level of an offering, then this level of an offering is appropriate. And I like what you said about it's an expression of compassion, because we want to bring everyone back. We want to bring everyone back into the community. We don't want anyone left out just because they couldn't afford it. So I like.
And one other thing I wanted to mention too, just as a tease, a little bit of a tease, but you mentioned something, anything that takes us away from the fulfillment of living a complete life. I have to give you a Spinoza quote.
Lovely.
He said, "A free man thinks least of all of death."
Wow, that is beautiful. Thank you so much, Mark.
Okay.
We look forward someday to a
Yes.
session that you will lead us on about Spinoza. Okay. Okay.
I love it.
Thank you, Richard.
I'll try to be brief, but it's hard for me. The notion for me in here is that it's not the individual that has a problem, that has something that needs attention. It's that this thing goes through the community and it's manifest in this or that person at times. And God is saying, Adonai is saying, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh is saying, I want a clear line between the sacred and the profane. And doesn't mean necessarily that the profane is bad or the profane leads to death. Indeed, the profane leads to life. That's about, women and men having sex. But, let's do it. Don't get caught up in that. You need to then have the priest come and restore you, because the tabernacle is within the people. God says, I want to live with the people. The tabernacle is in with the people. It's not as though there's a building there that the people go to, but the tabernacle is in the bodies of all. And if the profane takes place, there's emissions or there's blood, well, there's a time now to tighten things down a little bit. And so I think what you're saying is we want to bring people back into community, and we're always getting a little too far away. And what brought my focus here was the painting. And I see this as a picture of Ukraine. This is the wheat in Ukraine. And these dark masses are the interlopers. And we are now presented with all this vitriol on both sides, conspiracy theories about the CIA, terrible ideas about Putin, and we fight back and forth, and not very much is being said about what kind of talk, what kind of thought do we have that can bring us all back to the middle, where people can learn to get along with one another. And that's what the NATO and armament is being pushed east, and resistance is coming from there. And there's more buildup of blame and more building of in each of our hearts and each of our souls about what to do about it. And we're all on edge about it. And we all need a priestly touch. And we can do that by taking a breath, not responding with vitriol, creating community, being nice. And we're challenged to do that. And I like the Spinoza quote, because this situation we're in with all these vibrations, the loss of the middle of the body politic, the lack of abortion in these states now that are all on one side and the other, and the dissembling of federal control, that is can our be response to it? We can yell and scream, but that's not helping. And I think this is telling us you've got to do something inside each of us that brings a new set of vibrations into diplomacy. It takes a long time for the human beings to get to the point of doing diplomacy. There's so many steps of development and identity to go through, and we're up against it now. So that's why I saw this looks like Ukraine. I'm done.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you. Let me invite Robert, and then David Susan, and then Gary. Robert.
Thank you again for an engaging evening. Talk about the priest and what he did isn't the essence of every religion, charity and humility and humble service. And it's never arrogance and pride. It's never disagreement, it's agreement. It's never division, it's unity. So I see the priest setting an example that all can follow and recognize. It's not the soul of that person that's unclean. It's just his physical circumstance. Now, I say this every time. Now, what I really want to say, when these two quotes, 5 and 6, it is intolerable to be stopped by a frame's edge. How many people do this with children or other people? They put them in a frame. They limit their capacities, their abilities. They haven't even looked deep into their qualities and into their goodness. And then he says, the pictures are to be without title of any kind. I want no illusions to interfere or assist the spectator. And then he goes on to say, unkind or unpleasant or evil, let them or her look to the state of their own soul. What do we see in people? are we looking for the good in people? That's a skill. That's an ability. And we all have it, and it can be developed. And I love the fact that artists, true artists, everyone you have shown us has the courage to be true to their capacities. I think this is demanded in religion, in art, and in science. And religion, above all, has the ability to give morality, spirituality, life, essence to all aspects of life. So viva for the priest and
Thank
for
you.
this guy as well.
Thank you. And thank you so much. Let me invite Susan and David, and then Gary, and then Catherine, and then Steve and Sherry.
I think I'm unmuted. I hope so. I don't have anything nearly as spiritual and helpful. But last week, Steve Solomon and Sherry brought up, or Steve Solomon brought up the question of how did the surrounding cultures approach medicine, and that's a similar question tonight. And your answer, I thought, was right on, that there were different approaches. Some people thought it was demons, well, et cetera. But I got kind of fascinated with the question myself, and I Google groped around, and I found an academic article on a dermatology textbook from Babylon, which turned out not to be a textbook on dermatology at all. It turned out to be a magician's handbook. And the magician it listed hundreds of different skin conditions and what they meant. It was things like, do they cover the whole body or just one part of the body? Was it red? Was it white? Was it hard? Was it soft, et cetera? And for every combination of these kind of symptoms, it would then, the magician could look it up and would know then from that particular set of symptoms what the sin was that caused it. Like cohabiting with a woman. But depending on what the victim's particular, well, that's not quite right, but in any event, you could have very similar symptoms that were slightly different one from the other, and all caused by the same sin, but the condition was caused by the hand of a particular god or goddess, and being Marduk and Sin and I forget, Ishtar and the other gods of Babylon. And what struck me about it is there's, as you said, there's nothing in our Torah portion last week or this week that says you have this condition because you did something wrong and you're being punished. It doesn't say that.
Yeah.
And in the Babylonian magician's handbook, it also said which god or goddess you had to propitiate to get better. Well, we don't say anything about that. The answer to that question is clear. It's our God, Yahweh, Adonai, the eternal life force, by implication. But the priest had to go through this, that, and the other thing, and sometimes the sufferer did too. And it just really struck me how a fundamental, while imbued with many of the same Middle Eastern ancient worldviews about disease, how different this approach is.
Yeah.
And it's just exactly as you described in your response to Steve Solomon's.
Yeah, at least at this point in the book of Leviticus, there's an acknowledgement that trying to get us away from a very mechanistic view of the world, that of 100% causality relationships, that there are just sometimes bad things happen. And rather than focusing on why the bad things happen, and sometimes trying to futilely try to fix the bad things, let's focus on how to ease the pain, and that's a result of the bad things that have happened, and to try and return people back into the fullness of life rather than allowing them to die and just outside the camp of life. So thanks very much for that. Susan, did you have something you wanted to add? And then I'll get to Gary.
I do now, and that is that it occurred to me while you were talking that with God and Pharaoh, that there were these plagues that were afflicted, and all he had to do was to behave in a manner to let the people go so that they could worship our God, and they would end. And every time he said it would be, okay, I'll do it, they ended. There wasn't any, it wasn't necessarily something that he did other than he didn't do. It was a lack of action on the part of Pharaoh. And so all of these things were beset upon him, but they all ended quickly because, for one thing, we didn't have those rules.
Thank you. Thank you both. And let me move on to Gary. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you. Rabbi, at the beginning of the study session, you said, the way I'm reading Leviticus at this time, do you consciously go into a Torah portion with a different mindset? The reason I'm asking is that some in this particular Torah portion are difficult for me to read. And it's exciting in one way because I know there's something there and I just have to find it, but it's frustrating. And I'm wondering if I read it a different way. I'm just wondering, I'm asking you for a helpful hint on how to read Torah.
Well, for me, reading the text that's before us in this book is influenced by how I'm reading and writing the text of my everyday life. So I'm just very aware of how competent we are at creating outcasts in our lives, how easy it is for us to push people away and to stigmatize people in certain ways and to marginalize people. And it's much harder to, for me anyway, I think we find it much harder to find ways to bring those who have somehow been stigmatized, differentiated from us, back into some kind of web of community. And so I'm kind of reading this text now as a way of reminding us that what our priestly duty is, if you will, since we're all priests now with the destruction of the temple, our priestly duty is to find ways to bring people who have been marginalized and back into the embrace of a community. And that's hard, but that's what this portion is telling me, is that there is a way to do it. And it may not have to do with blood and hyssops and crimson and all that, but there is a way, and that's what our responsibility is, to figure out what is the ritualized way of manifesting compassion that will bring people back from the margins. So thanks for that. Is that?
Thank you. That was it.
Okay.
Thank you. I should have asked you that before we read the portion, but that's okay.
No, this is perfect. Thank you. Catherine, please share with us.
It's me, my turn?
Yes, Catherine, please.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, I was looking at the study sheet and thinking about this idea of making the outcast like a priest, and the fact that the priest, what does that mean? The priest is closer to Adonai, but the priest also mediates between the unclean and the clean. And so if you can get the outcast to mediate between those two states, that is a good thing. And then I looked at the painting, and I have a different reading of the blotches there.
Okay.
I see the blotches as more ambiguous. I see them as either bearing life or bearing death. We're sort of caught in between. And it's uncertain.
So
It's
what,
sort of poised.
I love that. It is as if there's floating on the surface of this yellow, perhaps representing the radiance of life. It's floating on the surface of it, and it could either be, it could either grow as a further stain upon the radiance, or it could somehow be assimilated into it. I don't know, maybe that's lovely. Thank you for helping us see another reading. And others have one more comment. Okay, Richard, yeah, please.
Well, I think Catherine said what I had in mind, is that mediation is what the priest does. And it's mediation we needed in this world, to take both sides and have people open up to being mediated. And the last thing is the word affection. These are called affections. And that's an odd word.
Mhm.
And I wondered what the Hebrew word is that's being translated as affection. It's not an affliction. It's not an illness. It's an affection. And affection is when you're sweet on somebody, or sometimes unbalancedly, that there's something going on with their affect, which suggests something that needs settling down. But what is the Hebrew word that is translated in the Plout translation as affection, as an affection of the head?
Right. So let me play with that a little bit, and then I'll send something out about that. Okay.
Good.
And then any concluding comments? Steve, did you have something for? Yeah.
Oh, I just wondered how recently we just understood medicine. When my son Daniel, 30 years ago, was 14, I took him to Gettysburg to see the battle there. And the troop went to Museum of Medicine there. And the curator said, "How many of you guys have a first aid merit badge?" And they all raised their hand. They said, "You knew more than the doctors at that time knew." All of the doctors that operated on the men, all of the men died. The nurses who were wearing gloves and took care of the men, they all lived because they got blood on their hands or their gloves, and they boiled them that night so they would be clean the next day. Of course, the boiling killed all of the germs and they didn't get infected. Where the doctors didn't do that, they were using their bare hands, and all of the soldiers got infected and then died from infection.
It's so fascinating. The whole history of medicine is really so fascinating. And I also want to acknowledge that Torah, of course, is not a medical text. It's a spiritual text. And I'm looking at what Clifford Still said about what he intended his paintings to do, that his paintings were intended not to impose some predetermined meaning onto the viewer, that the painting was intended to facilitate the viewer discovering something about him or herself. And I think that's what the intention of our Torah text as well, that the Torah text is less about imposing some kind of predetermined outcomes or understandings on us. It's meant to be a text that's designed to help us discover something about ourselves. And and it's giving us the identification of what is it that will help us live a healthy, wholesome, and full life. And the text helps us explore the inner so that we can create a better outer as well as a good inner. So I'd like to go ahead, Susan. Let me
Well, I just was wondering, you said that Clifford Still was considered an outcast,
Yeah.
but when I read number 6, he doesn't sound to me like he considered himself an outcast.
No, I think he was very clear. He was very clear about his artwork, and he was very clear about what he was trying to accomplish. He refused to be defined by any movement, just as he refused to have his artwork define anyone else. Okay. He was very clear about himself. And I think perhaps that's what he wanted his work to do, was to be a facilitator, or as a mediator, as some of us have used that word tonight, to facilitate others finding out who they are, and then becoming more of that in the world. And it's based upon the notion that there is a moral value to art, and that art can serve that discovery of that moral core, and that how we discover that and what we find there is going to be unique for each one of us. With that, I want to acknowledge that this mission that the Torah portion is sharing with us is that we have a profound responsibility to make the outcast, that the one who has been stigmatized, like the most unstigmatized person in a community. If that's what our responsibility is, to make the outcast like a priest, then I'm so grateful for being with each one of you, studying with each one of you, to help us bring the outcast and the marginalized back into community, and into the center of a web of relationships. And Anna, would you like to share something here? Yeah.
Yes. I've been listening in the other room to this whole Torah study. This is a book called Civil Rights Queen. It's about Constance Baker Motley, who was one of Nell Moskowitz's closest bosom friends, who is the epitome of everything you've been talking about tonight. I highly encourage you to read this book. Would you care to just say a word?
Constance Baker Motley was the first Black woman appointed a federal judge in the United States. And she was also worked for the Legal Defense Fund of the NAACP, where was basically a law partner with Thurgood Marshall in all those early civil rights cases. And she was a pioneer, and was a blessed member of my family's circle of dear friends. So it takes courage to be a leader. And the purpose of being a leader, as we indicated, is not to promote one's elevated position. It's to do outreach outside the camp and bring people who are outside the camp through a process that enables them to come back into the middle of the camp. And with that, I'm so grateful that we are together embarked upon such an enterprise. It's so holy, so blessed, and will make each of us better and make the world a better place as well. God bless you all. Look forward to our
Happy
next.
birthday now.
Thank you.
So much.
All right.
And Baruch Hashem.
Thank you.
Thank you.